In this lecture, I'll be talking to you about how to conduct research. So one thing we have to remember is that solid research is the key to writing a good paper. And one thing I've been trying to emphasize in these lectures is that in order to write a good paper, you have to learn something. Right? You have to actually learn something. You can't just try and summarize what other people have done the night before the papers do. You need to learn. And you need to think about what you have learned, right? So there's a kind of reflection there. You read, you learn something, and then you reflect on what you've learned, and then you can write. Now, one thing though I want to emphasize is that I think we sometimes have this kind of problematic image of research. We think of someone, they go to the library, and they come back with their arms full of books. You know, they go and check out 10 or 15 books, and they download 20 or 30 articles, and that's kind of fun, right? That's kind of exciting. It looks kind of cool to have all this stuff stacked on your desk, and it's fun to go out and look for sources. I think that's one of the most interesting parts of research. The problem is when it actually comes to reading them, it very quickly becomes overwhelming. If you look at those 10 or 15 books and all those articles and think, geez, I got to read all this stuff. And then a lot of times I think people feel overwhelmed by that, the amount of that work, and then they kind of give up. They say, okay, I can't possibly do this. And then they just sort of, then they just won't do anything. And that's kind of a problem. So one thing I want to emphasize here is that for this paper, and a lot of times actually for research in general, I don't want you to think about doing extensive research. I want you to do intensive research. I don't want you to try and learn everything there is to know about a subject, a broad subject. You can't learn everything about religion in World War II. But you could learn something about a particular religious thinker during World War II. And so that's what I mean. I don't want you to read or try and do a whole bunch of extensive research to learn everything there is to know about a subject, a broad subject. What I want you to do is read a few materials very, very closely. Right? And one thing I want to emphasize, and most of what I'm going to be telling you in a lot of these lectures is how to work more efficiently. I want to save you time. I want to help you use your time effectively. And so one way to do that is to do intensive research where you really learn something about a narrow topic. That will help you then to actually write a paper most efficiently. And one thing I have to emphasize, this is particularly true for primary sources, right? For primary sources, you really want to look closely at primary source materials when you're doing research. That is the strength of your research, is your primary sources, not summarizing what other people have written about primary sources, but emphasizing what you know about primary sources and what you've learned about them. Now, you probably have learned about the different types of sources there are, but I think it is useful to do a little bit of review. Remember, primary sources are sources from the time period being studied. So, for example, if you were interested in the American Civil War, letters written by soldiers who fought in particular battles are examples of primary sources. Their diaries are examples of primary sources. And while historians tend to emphasize the written word, photographs of particular Civil War battlefields might end up being, or Civil War soldiers might end up being a primary source. Secondary sources, in contrast, are something written after the time period that they're about. Right? So if I take a bunch of, let's say that you do some research on the American Civil War, you read several different Civil War journals and letters, and then write them up into a paper, what you have written is a secondary source, right? You've used these primary sources, and you have written about them. That makes a secondary source. So your own paper, books, journal articles, those are all secondary sources. Now, what can be a little confusing is that sometimes a source could be both or either, depending on how you use them. So, for example, I did a lot of research on this Korean who killed a high Japanese official. And I used newspapers. I used, for example, New York Times articles from the year 1909, which is when the assassination took place. Now, if I was using those sources to talk about the assassination itself, they're secondary sources. These are newspaper articles which are just writing what writing up what other people have told the author of the article about the assassination. The person writing the article wasn't actually there, and they couldn't give an eyewitness account. They're just repeating what other people have said. So if I was just using this to get basic facts about the assassination, it's a secondary source. However, my paper was about how people perceived and understood the assassination. So I was using the sources not to get facts about the assassination. I already knew about those facts from eyewitness accounts. I was using it to get an idea about how did Americans understand and perceive this assassination in the year 1909. So in that case, I was using it as a primary source. So there's these two types of sources. It's important to use secondary sources, and I'll talk somewhat about how you should use them in this and later lectures, but I really want to emphasize you should be spending most of your time on primary sources. So it's important when you do your research to focus on the question of what you are looking for. Otherwise, you'll get distracted. You'll download a whole bunch of articles. You'll get a whole bunch of books, and you're going to be sitting at your desk looking at all these materials and not know where to start. So it helps to kind of limit yourself from the beginning to know what it is you're looking for, and in particular to know what you need from each kind of source. So, for example, when you're looking at secondary sources, a lot of what you're looking for is background information. So let's say that you are writing a paper about the American Civil War and religion. You would need to look, perhaps, at just read a little bit about what American religious life was like before and during the Civil War, right? That's kind of an example. If you're writing about, say, a Catholic chaplain in the American Civil War, you should probably try and understand a little bit about Catholicism in the middle 19th century. Not a whole lot, but some. In addition, secondary sources are very useful for filling in gaps from primary sources. So, for example, you might be reading a letter or a diary that makes reference to a battle, and you can tell that this battle really affected the person that you're writing about. You might need to look up that battle and see what was going on there so you can better understand what that person was responding to. Remember, people who are writing letters and journals, they and the people they're writing for probably know things that you and I just don't know because we don't live from that time period. So we may need to do some research to learn about what they're referring to. And finally, this can secondary sources help us understand the sources we're using better. So, just learning about what it was like to write letters during this time period, what it was like to write journals. If you're using a particular government agency's documents, knowing something about the government agency. So if you were using something by the U.S. Sanitary Commission, right, they produced a lot of pamphlets and some government documents during the Civil War, knowing a little bit about their history and who that group is will help you understand those sources better. Now, like I said, though, I think primary sources are actually more important, right? A lot of what I was saying there about secondary sources to help you better understand your primary sources. So it's actually a lot of times better to start with primary sources. And when you look at primary sources, at first, you just want to kind of look through them quickly, and you want to read them, but just read them just to get a feel for what they're about. And that will give you an idea of what your paper will be about. And that will give you an idea about the secondary sources that you need to use. A lot of times people think that they need to sit down and learn everything about World War II before they start reading their primary sources. But that's backwards, because the problem is you're going to read a whole bunch of material that may be interesting but not directly useful. You need to get a sense of your primary sources first that you're going to be using. Then you can start looking more closely at the secondary resources. And now, of course, later on, once you have a pretty good idea of what your topic will be, then you want to read those primary sources very carefully to collect evidence. And one thing I want to emphasize, you don't necessarily have to read that much, but you have to read it closely, right? You have to read it very closely so you can understand it, so you can make a paper about it. And having that deep understanding rather than reading a lot is actually much more important for writing a good paper. So I was talking about sources. We need now to talk a little bit about how we find sources. One of the best way to find sources, of course, is to talk to a professor. We've read a lot in our areas and we know something. So sometimes people will come to me and say, Dr. Rausch, I'm writing a paper on Korea. Can you help me with some sources? And a lot of times I can tell people just off the top of my head several sources that would be quite useful. So it's, take advantage of your professors in this sense. Ask them questions. But of course, one thing I want to emphasize, be sure that you thank them and also that you keep them up to date with your with how your paper goes. In particular, it's nice to thank them when you present your paper. So if someone, it's good to point out, hey, when you're presenting your paper, Dr. Floyd helped me with this and told me this was a good source. Now, usually when I'm teaching a class that's doing research, I actually give people suggested topics. Sometimes people just aren't sure what to do. So usually I'll give like a topic sheet and it will have examples of sources you should start looking at. And so I would look at the topic sheet. I've already done some of the work for you, and that can help a lot. Now, a lot of times people like to use Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is not a scholarly source, so you can't really cite it in your paper. However, Wikipedia is a useful source for a variety of reasons. For example, I sometimes use Wikipedia if I'm not sure of what years a person lived, and I need to include that information. Or sometimes I use Wikipedia because I have found a non-standard format for the name of a city or town or something like that. And Wikipedia will often, if I punch that in, it will tell me the correct standard form. So Wikipedia can be very useful. Now, like I said, for our purposes, though, you can't really use it for direct research, but it does help you kind of get an idea of the information out there. It can give you kind of an idea of a topic. So you may just, if you're not sure, if you're interested in something about the Civil War or the American Revolution, sometimes it's just good just to flip around on Wikipedia a little bit and see what you can find. Let's say, though, that you are pretty sure you want to do Salem witch trials. That's a very popular topic. One thing I should point out, it's a very hard topic because it's so popular, it's hard to say something original about it. But if you want to, you can give it a shot. But let's say you like that, you're interested in that. Well, Wikipedia can help you with that, right? If you go to Wikipedia, it will give you, have a fairly good article about the Salem witch trials. It just gives you kind of an idea of the chronology and things like that. So, and the current state of research. So it's good. But what's especially useful and helpful for conducting research is if you go to the bottom, a lot of times Wikipedia will have articles for further reading. So if you look here, there's a screenshot. And if you go over to the right column here and look under the Ray, Benjamin, you'll see a book called Satan and Salem, The Witch Hunt Craze of 1692. Now, why did I focus on that book? Well, two reasons. First of all, you'll notice it's published by the University of Virginia Press. University presses usually put out reputable books, so this is a good source that you could use. And the second thing is the year it was published was 2015. So this is a pretty recent source, and it's really great to start with the most recent sources because they will often give you information about previous works, and you can use their bibliographies to find more sources, but they're usually the most up-to-date scholarship. So this is where Wikipedia is really useful. It can give you a sense, it's got a bibliography right there, of what you could look at. So let's say you're interested in Ray's book, Satan and Salem. Well, one thing I would recommend to go to first, after finding this source, is Amazon.com. And if you go to Amazon, you'll find that his book is right there. And you'll notice it's not too expensive, so if you have some money, you may want to go ahead and purchase the book. But I wanted to bring us to Amazon, not so much to just simply order books, but because Amazon can give us some information. So if you scroll down, and I scroll down here, and here's the screenshot, and you'll notice a couple things about this. First of all, it tells us who the author is. This is about the author, and it says Benjamin C. Ray is professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia. Okay, excellent. So this guy's a professor. He probably knows his stuff. And he's at a University of Virginia. It's a reputable institution. And it says he is the director of the award-winning Salem Witch Trials Documentary Archive and associate editor of Records of the Salem Witch Hunt. Well, this is great. So we've only been doing a few minutes of research, and I want to point out I just did this spontaneously in order to prepare this paper, or prepare this presentation. You can see it's, in just a few minutes, I was able to find some very useful information, right? So through Wikipedia, we found a current source. Through Amazon, we found a current source. We found more information in this current source. We learned this is a reputable historian at a good university, it references some other primary sources that we could perhaps use. So this is important, right? You want to consider who's writing the article, and we want to do a little bit more research to make sure this guy really is reputable. But certainly he looks good. We're on the right track here. Now, one thing that's really cool about Amazon is that Amazon allows you to look inside the book. So if you click on the look inside button, you can look at the table of contents. And table of contents are very useful. So if we look at this book, we can see there's these different chapters, and just looking at them, you can tell something about this book, right? This book is going to be kind of a chronology. It's going to tell us how the witch hunt happened, but it's also going to engage in some theoretical discussions. So, for example, you can see there's the last chapter is called Indians, Africans, Gender, and the Black Man. And it's called that because basically when the Puritans would describe Satan, they would often describe him as a black man. And so there was this kind of, tendency of Puritans to see people of different races as demonic, in a sense. And so this might be this can kind of give you an idea of like, oh, this might be interesting. Maybe I should look at the Salem witch trial and race. And reading that chapter can help me to understand that. Similarly, maybe I'm interested more about gender. And a lot of times when people think gender, they think women, but you can also look at men. So, for example, there's, let's see, if you look at chapter 9, it says the apparition and trial of George Burroughs. That might be a very interesting chapter if you're thinking about looking at men here. So basically, already in just a few minutes, we have discovered a lot of very useful information, right? And this could provide a very good entry point. Just looking at one of those chapters could be a very good entry point for your research. Now, one thing, so you would want to get the book and look at those chapters, but it's also you want to look very closely at the person's bibliography. That's why I say it's good to use a more recent research, because you can look at their bibliography and see what has been written recently, right? This is a pretty comprehensive book. They're going to have a long bibliography with lots of useful information. And there's a good chance in the introduction they'll even discuss at length the different people who have studied this before. And there's also footnotes, and footnotes will often give you lots of useful information. So, this can really help you cut down your research time, right? You just get this one book, and you can get a very good idea of what's out there for you to try and get. Now, to actually get the book, you could order it off Amazon.com, and that's one thing I would recommend possibly, because then you can write on it. It'll be your book, and I mark up my book, so I write in the notes and so forth. I think it's very helpful. But another way, of course, you can get it is by going to our library, right? You go to the Lander Jackson Library homepage, to the Search Library Catalog area. And if you go to the Search Library Catalog area, you can search by a lot of different ways. And I'm going to recommend that you just search for the title, right, of the book that we're looking at, Satan and Salem. So you would just punch that in. And if you did a title search for Satan and Salem, then you would have a scene like this. You would see this, and you'll notice. Now, first of all, if it was at the library, that would be great. It would give you the circulation, the number of circulation, and you could just go write it down and then go to the library and get it. But you'll see here that we don't actually have Satan and Salem. However, you'll notice it says Pascal, right? It says your entry Satan and Salem would be here, but then there's the Pascal button. So if you hit that button, that will help you to get it from another library. So if you click on that button, you can see that there are, in fact, copies of this book elsewhere. And you can request them. So if you were to click on the book, it would take you to the website that would allow you to request it. So Pascal is really awesome. Now, unfortunately, I'm recording this during the holidays, so you can't actually. Pascal is closed. But Pascal you can use it to get a book, and it only takes 3 days usually to get one. And it'll come to our library. They'll send you an email, say it's here, and then you can just go pick it up at the front desk. So it's very, very useful. So if our library doesn't have it, you can always go and see if another more close library, library in South Carolina has it, and then they can usually get it through you through Pascal. So very useful service. Let's say though that your Pascal didn't have it. What you can do is you just go back to the Jackson Library page, and you'll look under the services menu, which I've done here, and you can see that it says at the bottom interlibrary loan ILL, and that will allow you to that will take you to another website where they'll ask you some information about you and the book, and then one of our librarians will try and look for the book at another library, usually outside of South Carolina. And that could take a week or two, but they usually can get you a book. So that's something else you can do if Pascal doesn't work. So it's pretty easy to get you can get almost any book you need. And I should point out that it's the same thing with articles. You can also use interlibrary loan to get articles. One thing you can also do is to see if your professor, in this case, me, Dr. Roush, has put any books on Course Reserve. Course Reserve, basically these are books that are taken off the stacks and put behind the circulation desk, and that people are allowed to take out, but only for a limited time. And usually I'll do this with books that are directly connected to my courses I want people to have access to. So what you can do is you can just click on the Course Reserves menu, and then it will come up Course Reserves, locate Course Reserves by course name number or by course professor. You can use either one of those. So if you were just to, I think it's easier to use name, you would just put in search for Roush, R-A-U-S-C-H, and then it would give you a list of courses I'm teaching. And if you click on one of those courses, then it will give you a list of all the different books that are there. And if you clicked on History 499, one of the books would be there. Or you can see that it would bring you to this menu with all those different books. You would just write down the title and the call number, go to the circulation desk and say, I'm looking for this book by Dr. Roush, or that is on Dr. Roush's Course Reserves. Could you please help me find it? And then you would just go get the book. So pretty easy. Now we need to talk about databases too, right? I just talked about how to get books. We need to now talk about how you would get things like articles. So the Jackson Library has a lot of databases, and you can just, if you go back to that library, you'll notice it says at the top of the menu, it says Databases A to Z. You can click on that, and it would bring you to a page that looks something like this. And what I like is, I think one of the best databases right up there at top, the Academic Search Complete EBSCOhost. So you would click on that, and it will ask you to input your last name and your L number. So you do that just to log in. And once you do that, it'll bring you to a menu page like this. And you'll see it says Databases and Peer-Reviewed Journals. Now, here's what's key. And I have to strongly emphasize this. And this is a pet peeve of mine. And I don't want to say there's a small minority of students who try and do all their research over the internet, and will just take all these little articles that are written by who knows who, and try and put those into a paper and just uncritically accept just whatever people have written on the internet as if it's necessarily factual, and that's problematic. And what really bothers me is sometimes it's just laziness, and I hate to say that, but it is a pet peeve of mine and of many professors and this is why I don't allow people to use internet sources for their secondary sources. Sometimes primary sources are okay. But internet sources, nope, can't use them. And one of the key reasons is because we don't necessarily know who these people are. Instead, you need to use journal articles from peer-reviewed journals. So you'll notice here on this site, under Limit Your Results, I've clicked on full text because you only want access to full text stuff for the most part, because then it's right there. And also under scholarly peer-reviewed journals, I've also clicked that box. Now here's what does it mean to be a peer-reviewed journal or a scholarly journal? Before your article can be printed, it has to be basically passed by several different scholars. So if I want to write an article for a journal, and I'm going to talk to you later about an article I wrote for the Journal of Korean Religions, I submitted it to the journal, and the editor at the journal had to decide, is this thing worth even looking into? And then they send it out to an outside reviewer. They send it to a scholar, usually a professor, but typically someone who holds a PhD in a subject matter related to the article, and they say whether or not they think it can be published. And a lot of times they send it to 2, even 3 people. And all those people have to agree for it to be published. And I've been asked to review articles before, again for the Journal of Korean Religions, and sometimes I say they're okay, sometimes I say they need revision, sometimes I say they're terrible, they can't be published. And in those cases, they don't publish them. So basically, when you have a peer-reviewed journal, that means the article you read, other scholars have certified, other experts in the field have certified that it is a scholarly work. That doesn't mean it's 100% right, it doesn't mean that they necessarily agree with it, but it does mean that they respect it as a true piece of scholarship. So that means that you can trust it pretty much as a source. That doesn't mean you can't read it uncritically, you still need to read it critically. But it does mean that it's written by an expert in the field, and that other experts in the field have said it's a solid piece of research. Doesn't mean they agree with it, doesn't mean it's perfect, but it is reputable. So you need to use those kinds of sources. So if we did a search then, let's do a search on this for Salem witch trials. Something like this would come up. And you can see the first source actually isn't very useful for us. It says, getting tested almost like going to the Salem witch trials. Discordant discourses between Western public health messages and socio-cultural expectations surrounding HIV testing among East African immigrant women. That seems like an interesting article, but it's not having to do with the Salem witch trials. So the first article is not particularly useful. But the second, that might be interesting because that's looking at documents against a particular person, Margaret Scott of Rowley. And that might be an interesting kind of article, or interesting kind of paper for you to look at. Because one thing I have to emphasize, if you do want to do Salem witch trials, you should focus on only one or two people and just look at what happened to them rather than trying to do the whole thing, because it's just not doable. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the third one, it says Power and Changing Roles in the Salem Witch Trials, the Case of George Jacobs Sr. And if we look at the next, you'll see number 6, I Am a Gospel Woman on Language in the Courtroom. And that's kind of interesting, right? That you could see if you were interested maybe in gender, this could make an interesting comparison, right? How were men and women treated differently in the Salem witch trials, right? That might be something that would work. But these are both interesting articles that might be useful. And you'll notice it says PDF full text. If you click on that, and you can even right-click it, I think, to do save as, you can get the actual article, and then you'll have it. And so you've been able now to, we can see in just the course of this research, and it didn't take me actually it took me longer to record this than it did to find this information. If you follow these kinds of steps I've been going through, you can do your research very, very quickly and find very useful sources. Now, remember that author, he had, we were talking about, that wrote the Salem and Satan book. Well, remember that they also, we saw from Amazon that he was, we learned a little bit about him. We saw that he was part of this group that he helped, he's the director. Now, thus far, we've only been looking at secondary sources, but we need to also talk a little bit about primary sources. We'll talk more about them in future lectures. But for now, I just want to note, you'll recall you had this guy, Benjamin Ray, who wrote this book, Satan and Salem. And we saw earlier that he is the director of the Salem Witch Trials Documentary Archive and an associate editor of the Records of the Salem Witch Hunt. So, knowing that, you could then do an internet search for this Salem Witch Hunt Archive, and I did that, and this popped up. And you can see it's very, very useful. Lots of good primary sources for you to look at. And so very quickly, right, just through this search, we've already found a lot of the sources we need. And if we look at his other part that he helped edit, it was this Records of the Salem Witch Hunt. We looked that up. And there we found that. Again, I looked on Amazon because it gives a nice overview. And this is a chronological ordering of important records. So this would be a very good thing to actually borrow from the library or to even purchase yourself if you have the money. And this is something you're very serious about doing. But you can see, again, very quickly, we have found the information we need. Now, finally, I would just note, there's a really good... You can also just do more searching around and seeing what you can find if you do like a source for documents or primary sources or something like that. And one source I often recommend that people look at is something called the Salem Witch Hunt, A Brief History with Documents. And this is really nice book that because it includes an introduction that you can read, which is scholarly, so it's similar. So it's kind of like Wikipedia, but you could actually cite it because it's by a scholar. And then it includes a collection of documents. And that can be a really good place to start. So that's just kind of an overview of how to conduct research, I think, in an efficient manner, so you can save time and while doing the very best paper you can.